Elagabalus was 14 years old when, driven by the ambition of his grandmother Julia Missa, he usurped the throne of Rome and transformed the court into a circus of excesses. Imagine a teenager crowned high priest of an unknown god, who imported bloody rituals from Syria and built a temple on the Palatine to replace Jupiter. His ceremonies mixed wine with the blood of sacrifices and rained deadly petals on unsuspecting guests, while the Senate and the Praetorian Guard watched in horror. In this video, we will reveal how a solar cult came to dominate the empire's capital, explore forbidden marriages that defied any religious norm, and relive the reign of roses that suffocated his guests in the name of entertainment. We will tell you how his gender identity and pro-woman policies shook patriarchal foundations, and how his grandmother plotted the conspiracy that led to his violent fall. Stay until the end to uncover the truth behind the myth of this heretic emperor, and if you are fascinated by the darker side of power, like and subscribe to join us in each chapter of this imperial saga. Rome awoke wounded after the death of Septimius Severus in 211 AD. His son Caracalla inherited a troubled empire. Legions pleased with his generosity became executioners when the money ran out, the Senate saw its prestige reduced to mere spectators, and the Praetorian Guard, used to imposing emperors, sniffed out every change in the wind with hunger for power. Caracalla, famous for the Constitutio Antoniniana, granted citizenship to thousands of provincials but paid for his luxury with blood. He ruthlessly killed his own relatives and plundered the treasury to fund extravagances. When he was assassinated in April 217 by a centurion on his way to a festival, Rome staggered once again. His successor, Macrinus, a Praetorian prefect, assumed the throne without lineage or charisma. His experienced magistrate's government sought to restore stability and cut privileges. However, he raised taxes and angered soldiers who missed Caracalla's largesse. The Senate, finally stripped of all decorum, remained divided between reverence and resentment, watching as the city burned with wage protests and covert plots. In this tangle of ambitions and betrayals, Julia Missa, sister of the late Julia Domna, raised the young Varius Bassianus as a tool. In the belly of the crisis, she prepared the conspiracy that would give rise to Rome's most scandalous reign. Julia Missa, sister of the powerful Julia Domna, saw in the chaos after Caracalla's assassination the opportunity to restore power to her family. With political mastery, she devised a plan to discredit the usurper Macrinus, spreading the rumor that her grandson Varius Avitus Bassianus was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son. Her daughter Julia Soaemias publicly renounced her husband, while messengers spread the news among the legions stationed in Syria. The climax came in Emesa, before the statue of Elagabalus, when Centurion Publius Valerius Comazon and his men proclaimed the young priest as emperor. On a June night in 218 AD, Macrinus was arrested and executed, and Bassianus, now Elagabalus, ascended to the throne at just 14 years old. This coup, woven from the shadows of family power, allowed Julia Missa to emerge as the true puppeteer behind this unusual succession. Can you imagine coordinating a conspiracy that risks your life, your honor, and the fate of an empire, relying solely on rumors and bought loyalties? Varius Avitus Bassianus, still wearing the priestly purples of Elagabalus, was brought before the statue of the solar god in Emesa. There, Centurion Publius Valerius Comazon proclaimed the young priest as emperor, brandishing the crown under the astonishment of the legions. That same night, June 8, 218 AD, Macrinus was arrested. His swift execution sealed the success of the coup. In Rome, Bassianus took the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. At just 14, his first decisions were to grant extensive powers to Julia Missa and appoint her allies to key positions in the Praetorian Guard. The capital was shocked, teenagers and generals shared the same throne, and the Senate, stunned, grudgingly accepted an emperor imposed by the legions. This seizure of power was not a spontaneous act, but the culmination of a family plan. Well-placed rumors, purchased favors, and faith in a foreign god converged to elevate a boy who would change Rome forever. Can you imagine the whispers and fear as an inexperienced youth assumed command of a millennia-old empire? Elagabalus introduced the cult of Elagabalus to Rome, a solar god brought from Emesa. Imagine the stone statue, adorned with gold and gems, parading down the road with torches and drums. Upon reaching the Palatine, he began the construction of a colossal temple, displacing the foundations of Domitian's original project for Jupiter. Every day, priests opened the sanctuary doors at dawn, letting columns of worshippers in white robes pass through, although the true ceremony was held at midday when the sun's brilliance scorched the sacred courtyard. There, Elagabalus, clad in a purple cloak, raised his scepter toward the sun while the bronze of the altar sparkled and incense smoke rose in golden spirals. The senators, forced by decree, walked behind him in procession, carrying offerings of wheat and wine. The high priest loudly proclaimed that Elagabalus was the invincible sun and should replace all ancient deities. Anyone who protested, even with a gesture, was punished with fines or exile. Suddenly, the Roman pantheon was subjected to a single exotic god, and the Senate witnessed in horror that the religious empire was now dressed in foreign light. Can you imagine the turmoil in the temples, the fury of Jupiter's priests seeing their altars empty, and the widespread devotion to a foreign cult imposed by a teenager? In the heart of Elagabalus' grand temple, splendor gave way to terror, days of massive sacrifices where the altar overflowed with the blood of cows, sheep, and even children from patrician families. Under the midday sun, Elagabalus, clad in a golden solar tunic, raised the knife before thousands of expectant worshippers. The thunder of Syrian drums set the rhythm as the crimson liquid gushed in torrents, soaking the polished marble. But his extravagance reached a deadly extreme when, during one of his infamous dinners, he ordered rose and violet petals to rain from the triclinium's skylight. At first, his guests, intoxicated by wine and amazement, applauded the spectacle. However, the floral rain became so dense that airways collapsed, many were left motionless, suffocated in a fragrant bed where terror silently bloomed. Herodian and Dio Cassius agree in portraying that banquet as a rite of horror disguised as luxury. Bodies fell without aid, and the emperor himself considered the massacre a diversion worthy of a god. The account of this deadly rain spread throughout Rome as a warning: unchecked power can turn beauty into executioner. Can you imagine participating in a ritual where magnificence and death dance to the same rhythm, and a single imperial gesture is enough to turn the feast murderous? Picture an imperial triclinium adorned with purple drapes and tables overflowing with rare delicacies, imported pheasants, Nile lobsters, and cakes perfumed with Cilician honey. Everything was arranged for a spectacle of infinite opulence, where Elagabalus offered his guests exotic game and wine mixed with oriental spices, and sometimes, with the very blood of his sacrifices. During these dinners, the feasts lasted until dawn, trays circulated endlessly, bearers carried golden platters, and servants replenished cups with elixir that promised euphoria. Yet delight carried a macabre undertone. In certain banquets, the emperor ordered drinks infused with drops of freshly spilled animal blood, believing it conferred divine vigor on those who drank. Some accounts claim that, in his quest for the perfect, Elagabalus even used the hot liquid of cult victims instead of water for cooking. As the crimson-stained wine flowed down throats, he staged theatrical games, dancers covered in rose petals, collected from sacred temples, later set ablaze, producing dense, intoxicating smoke, musicians playing drums until exhaustion, and diners competing for sugared pig's feet or boar glands, considered aphrodisiacs. These orgies of splendor clashed with the Roman ideals of dignitas and moderation. The satisfied emperor tossed coins to the crowd to win applause, while the Senate watched in silence, powerless to stop the carnival of excess. For the common people, these feasts became a symbol of unbridled power, capable of sacrificing morality and public coffers in the name of hedonistic pleasure. Can you imagine attending a dinner where luxury and blood mingle on every plate, and the desire to impress turns into a display of power as disturbing as it is irresistible? Elagabalus chained the bonds of power with a parade of weddings as scandalous as they were strategic. First, he married Paula, daughter of a praetorian prefect, only to repudiate her upon discovering physical defects that offended his vanity. Then he broke the vow of a Vestal, Julia Aquilia, a sacrilegious pairing whose union defied the vow of virginity punishable by death. Not content with scandal, he contracted Faustina, great-granddaughter of Marcus Aurelius, hoping for an heir. He dismissed her a year later when she failed to meet his desires. Then he consummated a bigamous union with Heraclius, a Greek slave, and Aurelia Sodico, a famous athlete, two simultaneous spouses whose bodies he admired and despised with the same arbitrariness. Each marriage violated millennia-old taboos and exposed the spouses to ridicule and disdain from the Senate. His grandmother, fearing a total collapse of social order, revoked and annulled these unions one by one, but the damage was already done. Rome witnessed for the first time an emperor who crossed all boundaries of traditional marriage. Can you imagine being forced to marry the young tyrant, knowing that your alliance could turn into your own rejection by imperial whim? Elagabalus broke all molds by wearing feminine tunics, sporting wigs, and painting his eyes like a priestess of the solar cult. This was not mere fashion whim. He declared his desire to become a woman, offered rewards to doctors for genital surgery, and demanded his subjects call him empress instead of emperor. Furthermore, he elevated Julia Soemia, his mother, to the rank of consul, making her the first woman with voice and vote in the Senate. Shortly after, he established a female Senate on the Quirinal Hill, where aristocratic matrons debated decrees and dictated customary rules. This political audacity, inspired by Emesa traditions where highborn women exercised real power, shook the Roman patriarchy. The forum filled with outraged voices, and the nobility accused the usurper of perverting divine order. In a society where dignitas and mos maiorum forbade female presence in the public sphere, Elagabalus imposed the unthinkable. He fused gender identity, religious cult, and government in a single act of defiance. This mixture of devotion and transgression turned his reign into a symbolic struggle for equality, but also a scandal that paved the way for his downfall. Can you imagine the horror of the elites witnessing a young emperor dressed as a woman, stripped of all conventions, and his mother occupying the seat of a consul in the heart of Rome? While Rome debated its fate in the Senate, Elagabalus celebrated a parallel power based on indulgence. He opened the doors of the imperial palace, transforming the apartments into luxurious brothels, entire corridors where slaves and exiles freely offered themselves to those who crossed the threshold. On one occasion, he ordered all the city's prostitutes, free and captive, to gather in the forum, parading for 3 days with blaring music and dancers dressed in fine, gold-embroidered tunics. In his orgies, the emperor mixed wine with a hashish extract imported from Asia, a potion that induced euphoria and drowsiness, ideal for dissolving any trace of dignitas. Banquets became bacchanals where the lines between servants and clients blurred, athletes and musicians entered with the promise of imperial favor, and many ended up returned under the cover of night as imperial lovers, granted titles and privileges. These practices, beyond being mere hedonistic whims, served a political purpose. They generated direct loyalty to the throne, bypassed the traditional senatorial clientele, and reminded everyone that true power resided in the favor of the young emperor. But this, bread and pleasure, strategy clashed head-on with conservative morality. The people were scandalized to learn that the imperial baths, once a refuge of hygiene, had turned into public sexual masquerades. Elagabalus empowered those who participated in his parties with minor offices and tax exemptions, creating a network of dependents ready to defend him even in the face of Senate disdain. Yet, that cult of pleasure sowed hatred in traditional hearts and eroded imperial legitimacy with every emptied cup and every night of excess. Could you govern an empire by granting favors in exchange for loyalty, knowing that your political strength relies on desire and indulgence? The ostentatious reign of Elagabalus unleashed a wave of outrage among the Roman elite. Senators, faithful to the mos maiorum, watched in horror as the temple of Jupiter emptied, replaced by the altars of Elagabal, and a teenage boy dressed in women's tunics presided over a female senate on the Quirinal Hill. Murmurs spread through the Palatine corridors. Foreign cults, sacrilegious marriages, and imperial orgies had fractured the dignitas of the state. Meanwhile, the Praetorian Guard, which had initially hailed the young emperor, began to question the wisdom of following orders that contradicted their own military tradition. The veterans, puzzled by the emperor's preference for athletes and courtesans over comrades in arms, started re-evaluating their loyalties. In this climate of discontent, Julia Maesa orchestrated the climax of her intrigue. She convinced Elagabalus to name his cousin Alexander Severus, a 12-year-old with a more acceptable lineage, as heir. She spread rumors of betrayal against the eccentric emperor, promoted Alexander's figure among the troops, and took advantage of growing unpopularity to dismantle the cult of Elagabal. On March 11, 222 AD, the guard rose. When Elagabalus appeared at the camp intending to quell the revolt, he was ignored as they hailed Alexander. Without bloodshed, but with invisible daggers of betrayal, his grandmother proclaimed the change and sealed the fate of a reign that, after barely 4 years, would end under the edge of family conspiracy. Could you imagine conspiring against your own grandson to save the honor of Rome, riding the wave of public outrage and the disdain of the legions? On March 11, 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard, weary of excesses and desecrations, staged a silent mutiny. In the camp, they favored 12-year-old Alexander Severus, whose inherited features from Caracalla were more acceptable than the eccentricities of a teenager who defied gods and customs. Confident, Elagabalus appeared on the parade ground accompanied by his mother, Julia Soaemias, hoping to quell the rebellion with a gesture of authority. But he was ignored. The Praetorians chanted Alexander's name, then they gave the order to arrest the heretic and his advisor. Without resistance, both were captured and beheaded. Their bodies, stripped and dragged through the streets, were displayed as a warning. Elagabalus' body was cast into the Tiber, Julia Soaemias left in an unknown location. The Senate decreed damnatio memoriae, they erased their names, demolished their temples, and nullified their edicts. Within hours, the young man who had aspired to be a god went from divinity to victim, and his shadowy reign became a cautionary tale about the limits of power. Over the centuries, Elagabalus' figure acquired legendary dimensions. In the Middle Ages, Orosius and Jerome cited him as an example of decadence, and in the Renaissance, Boccaccio dedicated bitter pages to his grandmother, portrayed as the nurse of infamy. His audacity in transgressing gender norms and empowering women, however, anticipated modern debates about identity and political space. Romantic and surrealist authors used his story to satirize tyranny and give voice to the marginalized. Today, his reign is studied both for its horror and for its flashes of social revolution, a usurper who forever changed the conception of power and gender in Rome. Elagabalus teaches us that the line between genius and madness is as fragile as a crown of flowers. A teenager shook a millennia-old empire with foreign cults, bloody feasts, and forbidden marriages, only to fall by the same audacity that had elevated him. Who do you think was the true protagonist of this imperial tragedy? The god who wanted to be king, the grandmother who wove the plot, or the guard who restored order? Tell us in the comments. If this dive into Rome's darkest hours fascinated you, like and subscribe. We have more stories to unearth, and hit the bell so you won't miss a single revelation.